I've played Yu-Gi-Oh! For a very long time, and one of the things that I've noticed is that yes, new cards come out and old cards go away, but also just the way that people tackle deck building and playing the game have changed over the past 15-20 years. One of the ways that something has changed is that people don't really think of conversion side decks anymore, and many of you watching this video might not even really know what that is. I mean, maybe you can guess from the title what it is, but in terms of people actually using conversion side decking, we just don't really see it anymore, and we haven't seen it for a while. In today's video, I want to look at some of the more popular and successful conversion side decks, and then also look at why these things don't really exist anymore. Why aren't people using conversion side decks? Because there are a few interesting answers. First up, what is a conversion side deck? Well, a conversion side deck is one where your 15 cards in the side deck aren't necessarily matchup specific, but rather you side 15 cards out of your main deck to put in 15 cards from a different strategy. This has some unique advantages, as we'll see in the decks we look at in today's video, but the thing to keep in mind here is that usually with a conversion side deck, all the cards in the side deck aren't matchup specific, they're all just of another archetype, which means that when you're siding like a normal person would in 2019, you don't really see those situations. In the cases that we're going to talk about, you are changing the strategy significantly than you would have if you were just using normal side deck cards. The thing that makes this work is called smokescreen side decking, something that once again sometimes we see, but people seem to care less and less about it as the years go on. Smokescreen side decking is when you put all 15 cards into your main deck, shuffle them, and then take out the 15 you don't want. When you do this, your opponent doesn't know how many cards you actually put in or took out, because technically you could put 15 cards in and then shuffle your deck and then take those exact same 15 cards out. The advantage of conversion side decking when you use this tactic is that in Game 3, your opponent has no clue which deck you're actually going to play. And while the decks in today's video are not the only examples of conversion side decking, they are three very successful examples, and I think they're a really good starting point for understanding how this works. The first time that I think a lot of people learned about conversion side decking on a competitive level was a top 8 wind-up beast deck from YCS Long Beach back in 2012. Now, unfortunately, I do not have a printed version of the deck list. There's only a YouTube video out there, but the basics here are that in game 1, Wilson would use beast monsters and beast synergies to sort of stun his opponent. He had cards like Thunder King in there, and he had cards like Ape Fighter in there, and a lot of trap cards, so when his opponents played against him going into game 2, they would side out their hand traps like Effect Failure and Max C, because those cards aren't very good against stun-based strategies. Little did they realize though that in game 2, Wilson would side out many of his slower stun cards and side in 15 wind-up cards, and there already was a wind-up rabbit in the main deck. One of the key parts of building a conversion side deck is making sure your main deck has cards that work with both strategies, and in this case, wind-up rabbit worked with Horn of the Phantom Beast, a very important card for both sides of the deck, but also it was a wind-up monster, so it worked with the wind-ups. This way, in game 2, he knew that all of his wind-up combos would go uninterrupted and give him a pretty easy win. And then if there was a game 3, his opponent had no idea what to side in or out, because they didn't know if he was going to stick with wind-ups, in which case they should put back in the hand traps, or if he's going to switch back to stun, in which case the hand traps would be awful. This strategy was so successful that he started off 9-0 and made it all the way to top 8, a pretty impressive finish for a pretty crazy deck. Also keep in mind that YCS Long Beach was the biggest YCS in history with over 4,000 players, so the fact that this strategy was able to go all the way to top 8 through so many rounds and so many great opponents is really impressive. Another example of a more mild conversion side deck was in 2013 with Patrick Hoban's Infernity deck list. Now, keep in mind at this point, Patrick Hoban is a good player, but he's not quite a named player. This was before he won the WCQ that year, but this is sort of the early beginnings of some of the things that we'd later see in his more advanced deck building. This Infernity main deck wasn't too crazy, it was just your standard combo Infernities, but what was cool about this deck is that in games 2 and 3, he had the opportunity to transition side into a more stun-based Infernity deck list. You can see cards like Infernity Randomizer, as well as Reinforced Truth to special summon it from the deck list, and also stun cards like Offering to the Doom that can take out cards one by one. Infernity Randomizer is a card that works in a slower paced duel, and this is sort of the opposite of that wind-up list, because the wind-up beast list started with a stun strategy and then went into a combo strategy, whereas this list started with a combo strategy and went into a stun strategy. In this case, your opponent would hopefully side into a bunch of hand traps, but then you'd have all these stun cards and they'd have a bunch of dead cards in their hand, allowing you to take the duel slowly by having a bunch of +1s with Infernity Randomizer. And then perhaps we have the most drastic and most well-known conversion side deck in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and that's Chainburn Inzectors in 2014 at YCS Berlin. This deck managed to get top 8, and this thing is insane. So game 1, or whatever games you want, you can play Chainburn just as you normally would. Keep in mind, back in the day, Chainburn was a fairly viable rogue strategy, and when this would happen, your opponent going into game 2 would basically take out all forms of monster removal and effect negation because the deck doesn't have many monster cards. What they didn't see coming though is that this wasn't just a standard Chainburn deck list, because the person would side deck into Inzectors by taking out most of their burn cards. What was cool is that cards like Waboku and Threatening Roar were both played in Inzectors during different times, which meant that you could keep those cards in and still just have a good Inzector deck with some back row cards that could protect your board. In this way, your opponent wouldn't have any effect negation, they wouldn't have any monster removal, and you could just blow up all of their cards with Hornet and then OTK them. The ability to swap between a non-monster based strategy and an all monster based strategy pretty much gives this person a huge advantage against most opponents, maybe even more so than the players that were switching between stun decks and combo decks, because at least in those cases you're still playing against monster cards. Anyway though, why aren't these decks still played? Well, the biggest problem here is that side decks need to be used for different things than they did back in the day. Back in the day, side deck cards weren't as important. I mean, don't get me wrong, they were important, but if you look at those older side deck lists, you oftentimes see a bunch of 1-ofs and a bunch of 2-ofs, where a lot of times these days you see almost entirely 3-ofs and sometimes 2-ofs. In general, people are side decking cards in 2018 or 2019, and looking forward at least, you want to play a bunch of cards that hopefully just stop your opponent from making a board. However, back in the day, that wasn't nearly as prevalent. It was around when you played against decks like windups, you wanted to have Maxis and effect feelers, maybe DD Crow, but in general, a lot of the time your opponent would be playing a much slower strategy than they would in 2019, which means that you really need those hand traps these days. For example, if you played a conversion side deck strategy right now, you'd be missing out on cards like Artifact Lancia and Twin Twisters, cards that are extremely valuable against a variety of matchups. Sure, you could still play that Artifact Lancia, but if you keep cutting back on your side deck space, the conversion side deck doesn't work quite as well. In many cases, you really do want the full 15 cards just to turn into a different strategy, and that's not always easy, especially if you need to play cards like Lancia and then you only have 12 slots. It makes it really complicated for deciding, well, which strategy can I put in that's actually 12 cards and will make a significant difference on my deck. In other words, the biggest shortcoming of conversion side decks, at least in 2019 standards, is that you really throw away a lot of your going second ability to actually win those games. These days, if you're going second, you need those instantly winning cards like Artifact Lancia or Twin Twisters or Red Reboot or Evenly Match or Sphere Mode. You need those types of things to just make sure you get to play the game. Whereas if you look at these old school formats, you don't really need that kind of stuff, because even the meta decks are a lot slower than they are these days. A lot of times, some of the best decks from 5 years ago would often just normal summon a monster and set a few back row as their opening turn. Even though decks like windups and Inzectors and Dino Rabbit seem really scary when they make their good boards, what a lot of people don't realize if you didn't play back in the day is that oftentimes those good boards didn't really come out on the first turn. Oftentimes with Dino Rabbit, you would just normal summon a level 4 1900 attack dinosaur monster, and that would be your entire first turn play. Obviously by 2019 standards, that's not very good, but what I'm trying to say is that back in the day, you didn't really need as many cards that were as good going second, because if you didn't have cards that stopped your opponent, oftentimes they wouldn't even make a play that would be worth stopping. Also keep in mind that staple cards, at least spells and traps that are staples, don't really exist in the same fashion that they used to 5-6 years ago. For example, these days, the closest thing to a staple card we have is something like hand traps, but even then, not every deck plays those, at least not in the same numbers. Salamangreats and Sky Strikers play a ton of hand traps, sometimes 12 of them, whereas something like Orcust only plays 3 or 6, sometimes 0, and something like Thunder Dragons usually doesn't play any hand traps in the main deck. In this way, you can see one of the issues with doing these conversion conversion side decks these days is that not only do you have to change the monster cards, but you'd also have to change the archetype specific spells and traps, whereas with these older deck lists, a lot of times the spells and traps work with both strategies. Obviously, even in the Chainburn one, which is like the craziest example, many of those trap cards work just fine alongside the Inzektor monsters. I never want to say that something is gone forever in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because old strategies sometimes come back to the forefront of competition, and I think a conversion side deck might work in the future. But for now, at least, with the design that Konami seems to be doing with new strategies and new archetypes and new cards, it seems like conversion side decking is very, very difficult. Maybe in the future, if we ever get back to a point where spells and traps are more generic cards, not archetype cards, maybe then we'll see conversion side decks, and that'd be pretty neat. But at least where we are right now, we're pretty unlikely to see conversion side decks, at least for the next couple of years. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on this old forgotten Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategy. If you'd like to see more of this type of video, I'm interested in doing them. I just want to see what the feedback is on this initial first installment. I'll see you guys later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.